Good evening, and can I welcome you most warmly to this evening's event. I'm Patricia Hewitt, and I chair the UK-India Business Council. Shri Arun Jaitley, Honourable Finance Minister of the Government of India, Your Excellency, the High Commissioner, Shri Arun Jaitley, Dr. Jyotsna Suri, the President of FICCI, Rajan Bharti Mittal, Vice Chairman of Bharti Enterprises, and of course a former President of FICCI, Sir David Wright, Vice Chairman of Barclays, our two Deputy High Commissioners here, Dr. Virendra Paul, Deputy High Commissioner for India, and Kumar Iyer, Deputy High Commissioner for Britain in India, and all the many distinguished business leaders, parliamentarians, colleagues, and friends. Welcome. I'm delighted to be welcoming and hosting this event here on behalf of the Indian High Commission, FICCI, and UK-India Business Council, and delighted that we have worked in such a close collaboration for this very important occasion. I think the sheer numbers of people who are here this evening, and here in London on a Friday evening, they are themselves a real tribute to our guest of honour. And it is for me, if I may say so, a particular personal pleasure to welcome Shri Arun Jaitley to the event this evening. He and I first met many years ago when he was the Commerce Secretary in the then NDA government, and I was the Trade and Industry Secretary in the then British government. But all of us, sir, are honoured by your presence here this evening, just 2 weeks after your budget, and of course with Parliament still in session, deliberating on that budget. And may I, on behalf, I'm sure, of everybody here and the wider business community, congratulate you on the budget of 2 weeks ago, your first full budget as Finance Minister. You set out in that budget a huge ambition to propel India to sustained and sustainable double-digit growth. And I have no doubt at all that the measures that you announced in the budget, coming on top of all the actions that the new government, led by Shri Narendra Modi, has already taken since last year's election, will enable India and Indians to move to that ambition. But may we also, sir, congratulate you on the passage just yesterday in Parliament of the Insurance Amendment Act. It's been a long time in coming, I think it's fair to say, but you and your government have acted extraordinarily decisively and effectively on that. And that change, of course, has been hugely welcomed by many Indian and overseas investors, but of course British insurance companies, including Standard Life, the Pru, Aviva, many others, have long, for over many, many decades, played an extremely important role in India's insurance sector and will continue to do so, helping to mobilize those vital savings for infrastructure and other critical investment. And I'm delighted to say that it is one of those British insurers, Bupa, who have already announced, and indeed are the first foreign insurer to announce, that they will be taking advantage of the new Act in order to increase their investment in India. So we welcome that news, and I'm sure, sir, you welcome that very prompt response to the Insurance Amendment Act. The United Kingdom, of course, is the largest G20 investor in India, and I believe you heard at your breakfast discussion with the Chancellor of the Exchequer this morning that just in the last few years, over $8 billion of investment funding has been mobilised by UK financial institutions, much of it going into infrastructure projects, but also into many, many other sectors. Another example of the support of the British business community for Make in India, the central theme and strategy of your budget. And there are, of course, already over 700 British companies, many of them very large, many of them have been there for decades, but over 700 British companies who are already making in India, investing in India, and employing in India. And equally, India is itself investing more in Britain than in the whole of the rest of the European Union combined. And it was the strength of that existing partnership between individual businesses and between our two economies that at the recent launch of the Great Collaborations campaign between UK and India led Shri Narendra Modi to describe the partnership between our two countries as an unbeatable combination. And you may have noticed on the flyer that you were all given, I think, as you arrived, that we have adopted that phrase, an unbeatable combination, as the strapline, the slogan, the inspiration, really, for the 2015 edition of the India-UK Business Convention that will be held in Delhi in September. That will be another milestone in this partnership, and I hope one where we will see many of you present. But strong though our partnership is, and huge though our investment partnership already is, there is far more to be done. And all of us, sir, are here because we want to see more investment, more trade, more business building, and more job growth in our two countries. And it's in that spirit that I invite you to address us this evening, and I invite all of our friends and colleagues here this evening to join me in giving a very warm welcome to His Excellency Shri Arun Jaitley.
Ms. Patricia Hewitt, distinguished person of the dais, ladies and gentlemen. Today has been a reasonably active, if not hectic, day for me since morning. And one of the key challenges is, though a satisfying challenge, that to speak on the same subject before different audiences. Well, this situation has arisen essentially because the perception of India has undergone a change. And it's a very significant change that this perception has undergone. If we look at the broad last 25 odd years of Indian economy, we decided in 1991 to change and decisively change. We decided to liberalize, we decided to unleash energies of Indians, we decided to unshackle ourselves from controls, and we started upon a journey which in some small or large measure we did pursue for almost the next 15 to 17 years. You had governments of different political complexions, a government headed by Mr. Narasimha Rao, you had a government of the United Front, then you had Mr. Vajpayee's NDA-led government, and finally you had a government led by Dr. Manmohan Singh of the UPA in power. I think the consistent direction in which we began in 1991, it's a different matter where there are many people like me who feel that the journey starting in 1991 was already belated. It would have been better if it had started sometimes in the early 70s. And had it started in the early 70s, probably the course of history would have been different. And China in the 3-decade 9% plus average growth rate that it had may have had a competitor. But then in 1970s, it was more populism, more sloganizing. And it's regrettable that the 70s and the 80s substantially became a wasted decade as far as the Indian economy was concerned. I was recently, a few months ago, reading a book which was published by our Honorable President with regard to the dramatic decade. He calls it the 1970s. And just without agreeing or disagreeing, if you see the description of what was happening, whereas the world was deciding to liberalize, if you read that book chapter after chapter, you get the impression that the government honestly thought that if you confiscated the properties of smugglers or put a large number of people behind bars and managed to recover some additional taxation from them, India's economic problems would be solved. And in fact, if one looks up the archives and those cabinet notes which were prepared for those notes, for those measures, this was one of the steps. It's a different matter that at a time when all these steps were being taken, India's inflation rate had touched an all-time high of 33%. Our growth rates through the 50s and the 60s till the 70s were normally 2 to 3%. And economists world over used to sarcastically refer to it as the Hindu rate of growth. Unemployment was high, inflation was high, investment was not forthcoming, industry was almost unknown. And that's the time that the world decided to break off from the shackles, and we were still constrained by our limited ideas. In the 90s when we began, and I would certainly give credit to the government at that time in 91, which took a historic step, we pursued effectively for about 15, 17 years that course. And that had its impact. The footprints of that were so clear that towards the later part of the last decade, for almost 4 years in a row, we grew by 9%. We grew by 9% not because there were many policy decisions taken at that time, but because there was a huge impetus of that 1.5 decade of decision-making which had gone on, and we were probably on the right track. And somewhere we decided to blur our vision and go back to the politics of the 1970s. And I've been repeatedly saying that the fundamental mistake we made in that decade was that instead of concentrating on higher growth, more productivity, we thought that reallocation of the existing resource itself was enough, and therefore reallocation of existing resource would bring populism and hence bring votes. I asked one of the senior-most persons in the last government as to one of the most contentious laws brought by the government towards, or just on the eve of elections, as to what persuaded them to bring the changes to the land acquisition law. That farmers should be paid more for acquisition. I think everybody in India had accepted it. And therefore compensations needed to be increased. But why is it that we brought in a law which almost made land availability for housing, for industry, for infrastructure, almost impossible. And I got a reply that what had been then sold to the key decision makers was that this is a sure winning formulation for an election. But then between 1971 and 2014, India had changed. And India had changed, which was evident in the fact that the poverty rates itself had come down. India had become more aspirational. You had a very strong 35% or so middle class. You had a great aspirational class. You had people wanting to grow. And therefore, this populism itself was not sufficient. Let me start off because I think we are slowly overcoming some of the difficulties, and this remains one of the difficulties. Let me just start off with what this law is capable of doing to India. This law essentially says you've had the earlier land acquisition law from 1894 to 2014. So what was a law which provided for an inadequate compensation worked itself for 120 years. Now, in those 120 years, the law needed to be reformed, but India's agricultural production didn't come down. You had acquisitions of land, you had creations of urban centers, you had industries, you had infrastructure. But India's agriculture growth, the quantums grew year after year. So the simple proposition that if you acquire land for infrastructure, India's food security would be challenged is belied by the fact that it didn't happen in the 120 years that the earlier law was in existence. Despite that law, we grew year after year. The architecture of the new law was that if the state wants land and it's a power which is eminent domain, the sovereign power of the state, you have 65% of the people without adequate housing. You have low quality infrastructure. You have a huge amount of industrialization yet to take place. From hospital to a graveyard, you need land for every activity. And suddenly you had a law which made acquisition not difficult, but I would say impossible. The first part of the law was that if you want to acquire land, 70 or 80%, depending on the case, percent of the landowners must give you a written consent that they want land. Now, it's hardly likely that people are voluntarily going to give you consent, please come and acquire my land. Thereafter, you will impact, does it socially impact on people, the loss of land? Of course it will. It will lead to a change of profession. So if it does, you can't acquire it. The third hurdle is, will it lead to lowering the food productivity? It could well be argued that at least on this piece of land it would. It's only then that you can start the process of acquisition. I asked the framers of the law, do you seriously believe that any piece of land can be acquired under this law? And they said, no, it can't be. How will then India grow? The answer is, well, you buy agricultural land, go to the chief ministers, use all kinds of methods, fair or foul, persuade him to change the user of the land. And that has been one of the biggest malpractices that has taken place in India. Now, it was this mindset, and I'm only giving an illustrative example. Let me give another example. If one picks up and reads the correspondence between the then Prime Minister and the then Telecom Minister when the spectrum was being auctioned, you knew that the Prime Minister, you can read between the lines that the Prime Minister knew that there is foul play which is on. The very simple answer is, please go in for a process of auctioning. It's a natural resource. The state will get money. Nobody will come to the Prime Minister, nobody will come to the Minister, no ministers will go to the jails, no Prime Minister will ever be summoned by a court. for misusing a discretion. So please do it by a transparent market mechanism. But there was a sense of helplessness in doing so. With regard to coal, the former Prime Minister announced the decision that it must go by auction within 2 months of becoming a Prime Minister. Until for 10 years when he relinquished office, you still didn't have an auction. In fact, I am given to understand that the party in power used to issue chits, and whoever got that slip for a collateral consideration got the land, got the mine. So I told somebody that this was another form of the chit fund scandal in India, that you give chits and get a fund, and the mines go in the process. This is exactly what was happening. Now, how do we allow this system to continue? The same with regard, our mineral law says, which was framed when nobody had a demand for Indian mineral, because there was no industry, or there was inadequate industry. So you were wanting people to come in and take the mining rights. So the law which was then drafted by the British said, well, let it be done on a first come, first serve basis, because nobody comes to ask for mineral here. Whoever comes, let us lump it on him. But in 2014 and 2010, India had changed. The world wanted this valuable mineral. Our own industry wanted it. The actual users wanted it. The state wanted it. What is it exactly that Prime Minister Modi's government is trying to do in all this? So in the land acquisition law, we are saying, please pay them 4 times the market compensation. There is no difficulty. The farmers must get their due. The law had 13 exceptions to this onerous procedure. We've added 5 more. What are the 5? The defense and security of India. Now, under the present law, if land is required for India's defense, security, nuclear, strategic programs, there is no provision in this act for getting it. I was given the responsibility, additional charge of the defense ministry for about a couple of months. And one of the most difficult cases I came across was that we needed land for strategic purposes. Now, we can't disclose the purpose of acquisition. We can't disclose where those installations are going to be made. And then I looked the act 5 times over and backwards, and there was no provision in this act for allowing me any exemption. So I must first have a social impact assessment. I must have 80% people signing as to whether their private rights are on a higher footing or the defense and security of India should be taken at a higher range. One of the most successful programs Mr. Vajpayee launched was the Rural Roads Program. We call it the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. Now, under this act, for rural infrastructure, rural roads, irrigation, rural electrification, no land can be acquired. So India's villages will continue to live in darkness without roads, without irrigation. Irrigation is not an exempted purpose. And one of the biggest challenges to get India out of poverty is to spend a lot more money into irrigation. And one of the factors that I regret, even in the present budget, that if I had more money in my pocket, that's one area I would have liked to spend more. But with this law in place, I can't spend that money because irrigation projects, land cannot be allotted. The law is so unrealistic. 65% of people without housing have to come into urban, semi-urban areas. From huts and village homes, they aspire for better. Low-cost housing and affordable housing is not an exempted purpose. That's the 4th purpose. Now, all these are purposes which are going to help the en masse shifting and the improvement in the quality of life of rural India. One of the purposes is industrial corridors. Now, just as the Delhi-Mumbai corridor is being built, when you build a corridor, it's a narrow corridor, 500 meters or 1 kilometer on either side of the road. The entire rural area on both sides gets developed. Their land values go up. Infrastructure, at least cities have some infrastructure, the villages have no infrastructure. That's where it's to be built. So each one of these exempted purposes is going to help rural India. The other laws, besides insurance, which got approved, that all states which produce mineral, which produce coal, they will be allocated only by auctioning, will get a huge amount. And the amount is now proved. The humbugs who said spectrum figures of the CAG is a zero loss. It's an exaggerated figure, it's a presumptive figure. In fact, it's now proved that Mr. Vinod Rai was being very kind to those in power when he said that 1,86,000 crores is being lost in the coal mine auctions. With only 33 out of the 200 mines auctioned, we've already collected 2,07,000 crores. I don't know when all the 200 are auctioned, what is the amount we are going to get. Now, it is this entire amount which had been waived off. And as I said in the morning today at another function, that I feel ignored as a finance minister, that none of those who want the coal mine now come to me. Because they sit on their laptops and just give their bids and get the mines. That's the only way you can get it in any civilized jurisprudence. So too for the minerals. The debate today is, and I can tell you, if Dr. Manmohan Singh had his way, because it goes to his credit that in July 2004 he said coal must be allotted on the basis of auctions. That's the first statement which came. And if that talk had been walked all the way, the crisis that he faces today would never have taken place. Because no industrialist would have gone to the minister or the secretary to say, use your discretion and help me. He would have gone in for a market mechanism process. Now, it is these changes and reforms that we've been making. But the challenge is that those who inflicted the system on India would want that obsolete discretionary process to continue. And therefore, there is a raging ideological battle between reform and obstruction. And as far as obstruction is concerned, the only object seems to be some form of a sadistic thrill which is there in every obstruction. I prevented so and so. But then the government is fairly determined, and I think one of the great tests our government is passing through is, do we waver? Do we blink? And if we show any signs of blinking, then this sadistic thrill reaches a higher level. And that is something which I think the crisis that Prime Minister Modi faced a decade ago, he demonstrated that he had sufficient grit and he never blinked. And I'm quite certain the government is not going to blink on this. And therefore, we pursued insurance, well, most of the decisions don't require legislation. They require only executive decision making. It's only very few that require a legislation. And therefore, we are quite determined, even those decisions which require a legislation, that we pursue them and go through with that process. The roadmap is very clear, and the roadmap today is, we need a lot of investment in India. We've therefore opened our doors wide open. We need to ease in the systems of doing business in India. We are therefore slowly making incremental changes in that direction. We need to improve on the credibility of the Indian economy. So from an economy which 9 months ago had fallen off the global radar, we are trying to get it back on the radar. We are trying to get the world to show a lot more interest in the Indian economy. We are trying to rationalize our taxes, lower taxes, and a non-adversarial system, a fair system of tax jurisprudence which had brought us a bad name in the years to come. We moved on that track. And additionally on that course, there are a large number of steps to be taken. So from the Swachh Bharat, the cleanliness campaign, to the Digital India campaign, you come down to the entire package of social security which I have announced in the current budget, the financial inclusion program, a high level of concentration on creation of infrastructure. These are all areas which we are concentrating on. And I'm quite certain that in the months and years to come, all this is going to produce a large amount of results. We hope to end the current year at a 7.4% growth. Hopefully next year we should be able to touch or cross the 8% mark. And that probably will make us a faster growing economy. Competing economies are facing a challenge. And therefore our ability to draw investment into in India, which is going to be the starting point of a growth process which can eventually help us to service the poor in India, itself will increase. That's all I had to say as opening comments. And I'm sure if there are any other comments or doubts in somebody's mind, I'm certainly here for that.
As the Minister indicated, he's very generously said that he's very happy to take comments and respond to questions. But before we come to that, and we're going to make sure we've got plenty of time for that interactive involvement, before we come to that, I would just like to start by asking two of our panellists for very, very brief comments on the budget. First of all, Rajan Bharti Mittal, just sum up for us the Indian business response to Mr. Jaitley's budget.
Well, I have to say that good part is that the corporates and the governments are aligned, that it cannot be like a Bollywood movie that you want to see the opening day where it hits. I think the budget has drawn a very long-term vision for India. So it's not a budget for this year in particular, if I may say, but it sets a roadmap for the coming years of the government that it is going to be there. So if you see the corporate tax, it's been talked about that it will be brought to the levels that most of the Asian peers are at that level, with all the exemptions being taken off. I think that's a great start. Of course, corporates always like more on the table. We would have loved it if it started this year. But as the finance minister has taken the previous government, there are enough challenges on social security he's talked about and other issues that he has to manage. Good part is that the fiscal deficit red lines drawn by the previous government, while keeping that in mind, he still has put money in the hands for infrastructure development. That means more growth, more jobs, more industries around that. That's good news for us. Lastly, if I may say, the tax prediction and predictability, which is much desired and required by the corporates and business people who come and invest in our country, is most important. That he's addressed it very well, that what is in the courts, in the arbitrations, he's left that out, but in future terms, he's made it very clear that there will be no tax regime which will be adverse in that sense. And a good part of this government, I have to say, with both the finance minister and the prime minister, they are very clear, growth, development, and good politics can go hand in hand. So that's a great statement coming from the government to say, we welcome corporates. And I think that gives a huge edge, not only to the Indian corporates who are here invested, but our future potential partners and investors who come into India. We will be there standing by them if there are any issues. So I think totally it's a great budget, if I may say.
Rajan, thank you. And I think that's a very important message. I mean, as you say, not only about Indian business, but that actually what Indian business wants is exactly what existing British investors and business in India would like to see, and there's plenty more of that investment to come. Thank you. Sir David Wright, just perhaps a quick headline on the UK investor reaction to the budget.
Yes, Patricia, and could I thank you, Minister, for your speech, which sounded exactly the messages which we here in this country want to hear. Those friends of India, like my own company, Barclays, who employ a substantial number of people in India, have been amazingly impressed by momentum and pace which you have shown. And Patricia, better than most, will know that new governments must show momentum, pace, and the capacity to make the changes which are needed early on in their tenure. And that, if I might say so, Minister, is what we've been able to see. So for foreign investors, the style and the impact of the way in which your government has gripped the needs of the economy and grip to the interests of corporates is very important. And as a banker, there are changes which we want to see in the banking environment, but we are confident that in time that will appear. But I want to come back to what was said a moment ago about investment promotion. Patricia and I, when Patricia was a minister and I was heading up the UK government's Trade and Investment Promotion Agency, will be familiar with the fact that governments that wish to promote foreign investment have to get out and welcome and inspire those foreign investors. These are the people who feel that they want the receiving government to go the extra mile to meet their requirements. And as has just been said, it's the issue of predictability. It's the knowledge that the playing field will be flat and we will know what will happen as and when we seek to increase our business in India. That is, if I might say so, something which we're beginning to see and we want to see more of. It's a welcome for corporates, and it's a recognition that in a very wide variety of sectors, you want to see innovative foreign money, you want to see innovative foreign technology coming in, which will build jobs and build successful foreign businesses to the benefit of India.
Thank you very much, David. Now, I'm going to take comments and questions in groups of 3. Please keep comments and questions brief so that we can get in as many people as possible. Who'd like to? Yes, we'll come. One here. We've got some roving microphones, I think, so if we can have one over here, please. Then we'll go over there, and then we'll take a third over there. And then I'll take another round, so we'll get to everybody. But if we can come first there. And if you could just say who you are and which company or organisation you're from. Just speak into it. It should click on.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Honourable Minister, for your comments. Inspiring and mostly inspiring confidence, actually. My name is Anne Cormack. I'm from the company Rolls-Royce. We are known for making aerospace engines these days rather than cars. We also have a long history in India, and a very happy one. So we've been in India over 80 years, and our long-standing joint venture with HAL has been going for about almost 60 years now. A bit older than me, actually. But what I wanted to say was, in addition to thank you for your comments, we are aspiring not only to continue our existing partnerships with both Indian commercial companies, but also with the Indian government. And you mentioned India's defence and security and the difficulty of acquiring land to assure the defence and security of the country. On that point, I wondered what advice you would have for us to help us to extend our partnerships with both Indian companies, but perhaps especially Indian government, given that we are already strategic defence partners for all of India's key allies around the world. Your advice would be much appreciated.
Thank you, Anne. So a question there about defence, manufacturing and partnerships. We'll come back to that in a moment. Yes, sir.
Sir, thank you very much. Is this on? Thank you very much for taking the time to come and speak to us. My name is Nish Kotecha. I'm the founder of GeoSansar, which is a business correspondent in India. And I also wanted to thank you and the government's drive and acceleration of much-needed full financial inclusion. And it's been a pleasure to be part of the programme. 2 questions. One, I'd love to get your comments on the commerciality and therefore sustainability of the business correspondent product and mechanism. And that is taking the product all the way from maybe the government with DBT right down to the customers, ensuring that there is enough opportunity to create value for each stakeholder along the line. In my view, that's the only way you will ensure commerciality and sustainability for the long term in India. And the second question I have is around the payment bank licensing. It looks today that it's very difficult for an NRI to apply and also invest in that program. Why was the decision taken to almost exclude NRIs? And do you think that will change in the future?
Thank you. Two very specific questions there, and a third question over there.
Mr. Jaitley, my name is Seema Modi and I work with CNBC Europe. Some would say India is in a sweet spot right now. Growth is picking up, inflation is coming down, but there are many challenges that remain, including a lack of infrastructure and corruption. Despite those challenges, we're looking at the Indian stock market on fire right now. Do you think the international investment community is overly optimistic about what you and Narendra Modi can achieve? And can you bring inflation down when oil prices will potentially rise in the coming months?
Okay, thank you. Could we come to you, sir, for comments on those three questions? That should be fine there.
Well, as far as the Hindustan Aeronautics is concerned, it has been one of our foremost defense PSUs. There's a conscious change which we brought about in the defense manufacturing policy. When Mr. Vajpayee was in government, we tried to feel the surface by initially opening out at 26%. We made a marginal movement in that. And the last government wanted to bring it to 49%, but then the minister concerned would veto it. And therefore the government could not take a decision. Now the very first decision that I took was to make it 49%. I was the defense and the finance minister at that time. And my logic was very simple. We import most of our defense requirements. So we can buy from foreign governments and foreign companies, but we can't allow them, even with a 51% Indian stake, to manufacture in India. I am also conscious of the fact that there would be some IPR issues, some exclusive technologies, which would not be willing to come in at 49%. And therefore, we kept a leeway in the policy by saying that in a case-to-case basis, you can even go up to 51%. Therefore, India is going to see a lot of activity as far as the defense sector is concerned, the local manufacturing is concerned. To show our bona fides that we want to make India into a defense manufacturing hub, during my brief period as the defense minister, there were at least 2 orders, one for aircrafts and one for helicopters, where we put a condition that only Indian private sector can apply, so that they'll necessarily enter into necessary joint ventures with foreign partners and then start applying, so that domestic capacity building in the defense sector builds up. What if the defense PSUs also want to go in for a joint venture? Will the government allow that? My view is it would, in such a situation, if they ever wanted to get into this. Therefore, if you've already got a 60-year-old relationship, this is just the wrong time to break it. Because the best of that relationship is going to take place.
I don't think there's any danger of that.
Well, business correspondence, I didn't understand the question in the context of the banking sector. You see, we developed this as an alternative option. You have the brick and mortar bank branches, you have the ATMs, and those dark areas which have neither of the two, you have a business correspondent who's a mobile banker. He's a bank in himself, and therefore he goes and opens accounts, he gives you cash, he takes your deposits, etc. It's been a fairly successful institution. And in fact, in the financial inclusion program, the business correspondents had the most significant role to play. And therefore, that institution is going to be strengthened. I'll look into this question of the payment banks that you've said. The RBI is dealing with it, but I'll certainly make note of the fact. Now, what if oil prices go up? You see, a lot of predictions on oil prices has given astrology a good name. Because when the prices went down, nobody predicted the slide. So all these so-called oil experts world over, I didn't read a single article anywhere in any journal which indicated that from $114 the oil prices are going to go down. And suddenly, well, they'll stop at 70, they'll stop at 80, they could go down to 60, they could 45. So the experts now tell us that they'll stabilize, they may not go back, they'll go to some 60, 70 for a year or so. But then we'll play it as it comes. We've made use of India as a net consumer of oil and a net buyer of oils and commodities. We've used this opportunity to our advantage. We've passed on huge advantages to the consumer. In fact, the petrol prices to the consumer and the diesel prices, we passed on 11 times the reduction to the consumer in India. So the consumers in India are paying at least about 30% less than what they were paying earlier. Our oil companies in this process lost a lot of money, particularly the distribution companies. Now with falling oil prices, how do they lose money? Because they do future purchases and by the time they sell, the prices have gone down. So curiously, the oil companies have lost some 30,000 crores. So part of the reduced burden we transferred to the companies so that they are able to recover their inventory losses to some extent. Since manufacturing slowdown had taken place, some part was transferred to the excise. I have transferred some part to the highway construction program. And now from excise, I intend moving it to the highway construction program. So this will be a part of the public spending going up in order to rejuvenate the economy. Since you need it in infrastructure, we are going to make use of the reduction of the oil prices in both funding highways and railways. Because that fund which we have directly goes into those sectors.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll take another round of questions. We're going to start over this side. We have a gentleman there, and then just behind. Oh, I think we've got might have three hands there. We'll start with yourself.
Hi, Conte Esina from the Times of India. Minister, you have a very affluent and a very successful diaspora in the UK, the Indian diaspora. How exactly do you want them to help the government in the Make in India campaign, and exactly which areas do you want them to focus?
Really important question. Thank you. Gentleman just there.
Vivek Nanda from ACOM. We are a global consultancy based in India and everywhere else. In the infrastructure sector, we are heavily involved in the DMIC corridor. We're the program managers for Dholera Smart City. We're also involved in Project Seabird for the defense. Two quick questions back to back. One is on the Land Acquisition Act that you touched upon earlier on. What is the way forward and time scale you see for that? And the second question is, your budget, sir, was a little light on the smart cities this time round. There was some talk about that, and I was wondering your views on that.
Never satisfied. Okay, and then gentleman in front. We'll just take these three together.
Scott Young of Gemini Capital. Thank you, Patricia. Minister, you mentioned in your speech the level of 7.4% GDP growth for this coming year, hopefully, that India can attain. Question is, obviously, that type of growth requires energy. And I wanted to have the views of your strategy in terms of renewable energy and what type of incentives. We have quite an extraordinary expertise in the UK, as you know, in renewable energy technologies. And I wonder what incentives or strategy you're going to have for renewables.
Strategy on energy and particularly renewables. But so first of all, question on diaspora there, question on infrastructure, including smart cities, and then the third one on renewables.
Well, the diaspora is has a very unique position for more than one reason. they're mostly people who become successful in other parts of the world. And in fact, I've seen in a large number of countries, not only in terms of business, in terms of generation of public opinion, in some countries politically very powerful. I met a head of the government, one of the governments in Davos, New Zealand, and he told me that the way Indian diaspora is increasing in New Zealand, its role in the elections is going to be very significant in the decades to come. So that's the power of diaspora. It's not only a small group, but it becomes very influential. Just now I was at a bank function and I told a large number of British Indians who were present there that you have an enjoyable position that you can celebrate for two countries. So when England does badly in the World Cup, you can still continue to celebrate because India has to do much better. You have the option of cheering the other country. So you have the fortunate position of being on the winning side either way. But having said that, in terms of your investments into India, whether they come in terms of equity, whether they come in terms of any manufacturing projects, I think in any area, because India offers a huge opportunity today. And that opportunity would be available. You could actually invest in a long-term equity in infrastructure without physically being there if you have surplus funds available. You asked a question on infrastructure. I'll just be a little more detailed. It's for the first time that we are now taking a lot of interest on this larger question of how infrastructure is going to be funded. So infrastructure investments are long-term. You seriously don't expect private sector to suddenly bring the money and say, we'll bring infrastructure, particularly when the economy has gone through a slowdown period. And therefore, we are conscious of our responsibility. Now, I had a very difficult challenge this time. Rajan mentioned just now in terms of fiscal deficit, and the challenge was the Finance Commission has given 10% extra funds out of the total tax pool to the states. So compared to last year, I was 10% less affluent. I had 10% lesser resource with me. So obviously, monies would have come down. The country as a whole has a much larger resource, but the central government's resource had gone down. And therefore, I could not be seen cutting on crucial sectors. And notwithstanding that limitation, I still maintained a huge escalation as far as infrastructure funding is concerned. So one, I gave it a much larger budgetary support. Two, I have now told them that they can come out with tax-free bonds which they'll have to repay back themselves, but the revenue will take the hit in terms of the tax sacrifice. I've just taken an initiative some 2 days ago where the Life Insurance Corporation, the LIC, which is a cash-rich company, has pledged a support of 1,50,000 crores to the railways alone. That whenever you need the funds, take it from us for a long-term infrastructure funding of the railways itself. I've also created an infrastructure fund where the government has made the initial contribution. I'm getting some PSUs to put in more contribution there. And so that the other sovereign funds, pension funds also join that fund. So it's a permanent kind of a mechanism which we maintain for funding infrastructure. As far as smart cities are concerned, it's quite true that after taking an additional hit for the infrastructure, the resource available with me for smart cities was relatively lesser. But then in creation of smart cities, land is going to be a big resource. Therefore, when you have land, and that land itself gets converted into a change user, a commercial land, an institutional land, a residential land. So the ability of government to, or that smart city structure to raise monies out of that land is going to be much larger. Now look at the manner in which Mr. Chandrababu Naidu is creating the capital of the new state of Andhra Pradesh. He is resorting to what's called a pooling of a large amount of land. So you please give me your agricultural land. I'll convert all this into the capital city land. And this agricultural land as residential or commercial land, a certain percentage of it will come back to you. So he's devised an ingenious method of, and a large number of commercial and residential developers would like to get land in the capital of the state. And Andhra Pradesh is going to be a successful state. Therefore, he is using the land pooling and conversion of that land and return of a certain percentage of land converted from agriculture to commercial or residential as a resource for creation of that land itself. So these kind of instruments are available to a lot of people. Well, as far as energy is concerned, in terms of power, coal has been our conventional sector. We'll certainly have to rely on coal, and now with coal mining increasing, the coal will be available. But we want to at the same time disincentivize coal because it's not environmentally, ecologically very friendly. So we've imposed a certain category of carbon taxes on coal. And that carbon tax that we get is going for another environmental purpose, this Clean India campaign. So whatever we earn as taxes on coal is getting into the Coal India campaign. That's one of the budget proposals. And lastly, we are encouraging renewable in a big way. So over the next 1 decade, our renewable energy program is going to be massive. The Power Department is putting its head together into that.
Good. Thank you very much. Minister, I am very conscious of time and you've been hugely generous. If I may, I want to take one final question from one of the leading members of the diaspora here, Dame Asha Kemska. So we can just have the microphone down the front here.
My name is Asha Kemska. Sir, thank you for coming here and sharing your thoughts with us. I'm sure you will agree with me that in propelling the growth of any country, the key part is its people. India is a fortunate country with a huge capital, human capital. What I want to hear from you, in your roadmap, in propelling the growth of India, what investment is being made in developing, growing people, changing their mindset, their attitude, and above all, the skills needed.
Dame Asha, of course, is the principal of one of our most innovative and successful further education colleges within the East Midlands.
Well, I didn't refer to it in my comment, all the programs. But skill development program has been formally adopted as a national program. And now we have a full ministry of skill development. So you had skills being developed in 20 different departments of the government. They've all been taken out and they've been put together. And one department has been created. And the proposal is to start a very large number of institutions with regard to, so whether it's a plumber or an electrician or a driver, these are all jobs which are going to be created for the future. Therefore, skilling people in these jobs is what we are creating on. Secondly, it was started during the previous government in a small measure. We've expanded it further. Institutions of excellence for a different category of people, very large number of them to be established. So this so-called establishment of an All India Institute of Medical Science, an IIM, an IIT in every state of the country. Now, I'm quite familiar with the challenge. The challenge is not establishing the institution. The challenge will be getting the faculty. And therefore, it will take you decades before the faculty develops itself. But then better late than never. It's about time we started this, and that's one of the areas we are concentrating on.
Wonderful. Minister, you have been enormously generous. There are so many more people who would like to ask questions, and I apologise to each and every one of you that we simply cannot do that because, despite having started extremely early this morning, the Minister has another engagement to go to this evening. So it gives me great pleasure to call on Smimat Jyotsna Suri, President of FICCI, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Shri Arun Jaitley, Honourable Minister of Finance, Government of India, Sir David Wright, Shri Ranjan Mathai, Patricia Hewitt, Rajan, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the close of a very interesting session which has provided greater insights into potential investment opportunities in India. We all agree that the Government of India remains committed to taking India to the higher level of growth and development. Various reform measures initiated by the government and the highly progressive agenda set by the latest union budget are bound to unleash India's economic potential. In fact, FICCI is already driving multi-sectoral agenda with the UK and leading India-UK Joint Working Group on Smart Cities, as well as the Group on Education and Skills under the aegis of India-UK JETCO. As always, FICCI would be delighted to continue facilitating bilateral business cooperation between the two countries. I thank UKIBC and the Indian High Commission, who together with FICCI have organized this event. Thank you, Patricia Hewitt, Mr. Ranjan Mathai. Sincere gratitude to our Minister, first to Mr. David Wright and, of course, Mr. Arun Jaitley for sharing his views with us. But most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of FICCI, I thank you all for being with us this evening. Namaskar.